Hi golfers, Rob Cheney here from GOLFTEC Singapore. In this week's video we're going to discuss the wrists in the golf swing, how they work, what their function is, and why you've been doing it wrong your entire golfing life.
Swing. That was a good swing.
So as we discuss the wrists today, this video is going to touch on a few of the factors that I think are key in helping someone's performance and their understanding in how the wrist should work. This area of the swing is fairly complex. It combines a number of different factors: the wrists, how the forearms move, how the shoulder and the elbows move, and everything is also connected to how you hold the club. So a lot of the wrist motions that I'm describing or be prescribing are somewhat grip dependent. But I'll try and wrap it all up for you and give you something that's digestible, while at the same time helping to educate you and help you to understand the differences. So this video will include some detailed descriptions, some clear descriptions of what I see, what I want you to do. I make no apologies for that. I always pride myself on trying to give you clear, well-defined information that you can make sense of and then go away and practice. So as we walk through today's video, I'm going to be using some terminology that may be new to you, but I'll make sure that I explain what it means before we get stuck into the detail. And at the end, we'll try and wrap this up into something very usable for you as an individual golfer. So whilst you might have a better education, it's not necessarily usable until such time as you can put your hands on the golf club and make the necessary and appropriate adjustments to influence your ball striking and to improve your golf. So as I've already touched on, this subject of wrist hinge, wrist motion can include a lot of detail, and that's because there's lots of pieces at play here. We're very seldom, if ever, talking about the wrists and only the wrists moving. Also the wrists move through multiple planes of motion, so that means they don't just move in this fixed range or fixed plane of motion, meaning there's multiple things happening at once. On top of that, there's forearm rotation that happens throughout the swing. There's movement of the trail and lead shoulders in terms of internal and external rotation, and just abduction and adduction around the body. So there's a lot of things happening here that are influencing how this club moves. But let's try and break it down to something digestible. For me, wrist motion and the conversation needs to stem around club face control. Ultimately, the best golfers control the club face more than the poorest players. And to that extent, I would say that they move the club head or the club face through the time and space of the swing in a way that manages this club face the most effectively. And if I flip that on its head and said what the poorer golfer tends to do, that would be changing the orientation of this face excessively throughout the time and the space of the swing, making the swing far more timing dependent than the expert player. Every golf swing is timing dependent. Okay, don't get me wrong on that one. Don't think for a second I'm suggesting that there's one magical way to do the swing that requires or removes any need for timing, but there are certainly swings that are less timing dependent, and there are swings that require a whole huge amount of timing if the face angle is changing excessively. And for me, that's where the conversation about wrists really needs to start. And the biggest mistake I see golfers making is a complete misunderstanding of wrist hinge. And I use that phrase because it's fairly generic and one that I hear often. And in most cases, wrist hinge is a golfer attempting to hinge the club, the shaft or the head here, up towards them. And most generic instruction would tell you that that happens at some point during the backswing. One of the common messages I'm receiving quite a lot at the moment in my comments discussing this L to L swing, how the left arm and the club on the backswing form this sort of L shape, and then on the follow through, similarly, there's some an L shape to the arms and the club. And I think that building the swing that way and suggesting that there's some one piece takeaway followed by some magical amount of wrist hinge is not only misleading, it's just downright wrong. The wrist hinge in this plane of motion is not the wrist hinge that you should be looking for, but it's the one that most golfers are striving for because they believe it's what creates the lag on the downswing, which ultimately they think is going to create greater power for them. In reality, what it does, it opens the club face an extreme amount, shifts their path or their plane way off track, doesn't just stop them from hitting it far, it actually encourages them to hit the ball short and to start slicing the ball. So we're going to dive into that specific topic today, understanding that up and down wrist movement and the back and forward wrist movement are different and should be clearly understood and defined so that you can make sure you're doing the appropriate amount of each one. So for the specific purpose of this video, I'm going to talk about the wrist motions in two planes. The vertical plane, this way up and down, so moving the wrist up towards the radial bone is known as radial deviation. So that's the upward cocking of the wrist. And then the wrist moving in the opposite direction downwards towards the ground, or the uncocking, is known as ulnar deviation. So radial is up, ulnar is down. And then in the horizontal plane, the wrist moves back and forward in this condition. Okay, so when the wrists move into this cupped condition, that's known as extension, wrist extension. And when they're in this flexed or bowed condition, where the wrist is turned in like so, this is referred to as flexion, wrist flexion. If you grab a golf club and take hold of it and just move your wrists in these exclusive planes of motion, as you move the wrist up or into this radial condition, you're going to get to a point where you can't go any further. And if you do, and if you start to go further, you'll notice how the wrists begin to actually go past their maximum movement of radial and they start to extend. The wrists start to extend in an attempt to lengthen out or increase the range of motion here between the forearm and the club. So pure radial or upward deviation here, the cocking of the wrist, hits a limit quite early. And for you to be able to move the club any further and create more wrist hinge, if that's what you want to call it, your wrists have to move into extension. And it's this extension which creates the problems that you're seeing in your swing, which is the open club face, for the most part, very open club face, steepening shaft, and the need to start to swing across the ball to try and manage or square up that face, which is completely non-functional. And if you go the opposite direction and just move the wrist down into this ulnar deviation condition where the wrist is as uncocked as possible, something I think you'll find interesting as you do that, if you pay attention to the club face, is the club face goes from being a fairly neutral condition in this example to being, as I uncock the wrist, the face of the golf club starts to close. And once again, that's because these wrists don't ever move exclusively in the one plane that I described. They become a coupled motion, which means as you get to the end of the range in one plane, you start to influence, the wrist starts to move or is influenced in a second plane of motion. So uncocking the wrists, or having the wrists uncocked in this condition, actually does the opposite of the wrist hinge example. This closes the club face to the path. And this would be more conducive if you wanted to draw the ball or even hook the ball around a tree. And the trouble is, in a golf swing, you can actually have excellent wrist conditions and extremely poor wrist conditions, and on video or on camera it can look like you're doing the right thing. Let me explain. If I move this club up and begin to swing down, as I pull down and incorrectly extend the lead wrist, so I put this cupping into this lead wrist and I open the face, the club face there is quite open. From a face on camera view, it looks like I've got lots and lots of lag, right, which apparently is a good thing. So I'm going to keep practicing this pulling down and lagging the shaft, completely oblivious to the fact that I have a club face here that is so open and non-functional that if I really came down and hit the golf ball like that, I'd hit it so far to the right I'd probably never see it again. So what that golfer ends up with is, although they're practicing this pulling down and this lag that they think they need, really in reality when they have to hit a ball, they see this club uncocking early because they're trying desperately at the last minute to square up the club face and get somewhat of a functional face on the ball so they hit the ball down towards their target. That creates, as we've said in multiple previous videos, gives you so many issues with contact. Contact is king, the first fundamental. It gives you super issues with contact, hitting the ground before the ball. And you lose a lot of distance because by the time you end up hitting the golf ball, you see this scooping, flipping motion that you're all trying to get rid of, and completely, as I said earlier, oblivious to the fact that the whole chain reaction happened on the downswing as the wrist moves into this extended condition. And now I could do the backswing in a much more, what I would consider to be functional and efficient way, where rather than having the lead wrist extended, you can see that my lead wrist is very, very flat. My right wrist is now bent backwards. Okay, from the face-on camera, I've still got lots of lag. Okay, I still look like I've got plenty of lag, but in this example, the club face is no longer open. It's much, much more square to my swing direction. Much more functional. And going back to my earlier point, far less timing required to make this club face alignment work through impact. As I come back down to the ball here, the club face immediately looks like it's more functional, it's going to help me to hit the ball straighter. Additionally, I'm now able to maintain some of that shaft lean that I'm looking for, help me to deliver less dynamic loft to the ball, compress the ball more, ultimately strike the ball better and hit the ball further. So in summary, today's lesson is about understanding the difference between lead wrist extension versus lead wrist flexion, the influence that has on the club face, and somewhat of the influence that has on the shaft, because the more extended the lead wrist becomes, the steeper the shaft, the more flexed the lead wrist becomes, the shallower the shaft. And recognizing from the face-on view that I can twist my wrists about that axis from extended to flexed, and from the face-on view, the amount of lag that it looks like I have is no different. Okay, it looks identical. So you have been trying to create lag your entire golfing life and doing it incorrectly, pulling down on the shaft, opening up the club face, slicing the ball off to the right, and wondering what you're doing wrong. So in order to create the right feel, last week I talked about this in my backswing video, you're going to move the wrist into this, the right wrist into this backward bend condition, the left wrist is going to be flexed, the shaft is going to be in front of you and horizontal to the ground. You're going to move and turn that behind you and then tilt to the ground. Now I've got this functional backswing. We talked about the movements last week. And now I've got the functional wrist conditions that's going to allow me to swing this club back down to the ball, into impact, with the least amount of timing necessary to hit the ball solidly and to project the ball straight towards my target. For a lot of you, this is going to feel very different from what you're used to. I would encourage that feeling. I would encourage you to feel that, if anything, rather than cocking the wrist up, you feel like they're cocked away from you in this up and down fashion, but you use the right wrist and the left wrist and you bend them backwards to create the lag that you're looking for, whilst at the same time maintaining a club face that will function. Give that a try indoors with some dry drills. Give that a try just swinging down to impact and taking a look at where the club face would be, rather than the inefficient open face pulling down where the face would point extremely far to the right. If you're doing this well and you're keeping the wrist flexed down, as you reach impact, you should see how the face is much squarer and the shaft is leaning forward. Once you've done that a few times, feel free to hit some shots. The expectation here would be these balls should not slice. They should curve to the left. In this drill, as you start to keep the feeling of the face being closed throughout the backswing and throughout the downswing, the likelihood is we're going to keep the face close to the path, which will create the draw spin that so many of you are looking for. Okay guys, there you have it. That's today's video discussing the wrists in a relatively simple format and a relatively brief description of what should happen. I touched on already at the beginning of today's video, this has a lot of permutations, potential repercussions. A lot of it's connected to grip type, which again I could go into in future videos to try and help to iron some of that understanding out. But essentially, at the beginning of today's lesson, my intention is to help you understand how the bending of the wrists in this plane of motion, flexion extension, is the wrist bend that you're more likely to want to strive for in your swing, rather than the wrist bend up and down, particularly up, which is where most people are trying to get this wrist hinge. But as you can see from my left wrist there, as I do that, my wrist moves into extension. This is something you can do just sitting here right now watching this video. You can just put your hands out in front of you, and as you move them up, they reach a point fairly quickly where they can't go any further in that directly upward plane. But if you wanted to keep moving them upwards, you'll see how they start to rotate and turn. That coupled motion of the wrist is something that a lot of people don't understand. And that equally works the other way as well. You go down to a point. If you want to keep going down further, you'll notice how the wrists start to turn inwards. That's useful information if you're a golfer. It's useful information if you're a hooker or a slicer, because your slicers will fall more into this extended condition where you have too much wrist extension and the club is up, and you hookers will fall into a category where you have the wrist uncocked more, and that'll be closing the club face to the path. Guys, thanks for watching. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up, click that subscribe button, join the community, and post a comment if you found the video useful, if you've got some wrist stories or wrist lessons that you've taken, and how maybe your understanding of the wrist could help other viewers to take that information and make it more practical. Until next time, guys, take care wherever you are in the world, stay safe, and I'll see you again for a new video very, very soon.